The skull was catalogued in 1521, assigned a number stripped of its name, and placed in a drawer in a Franciscan monastery where it would remain untouched for nearly 5 centuries. No offering, no obsidian, no ochre dust pressed into the eye sockets the way this person's community would have demanded. Just a shelf, a number, a silence enforced by the people who had just burned the libraries. The individual it once belonged to was almost certainly Mexica, what the Spanish called Azteca, a label of their own convenience, a word that collapsed dozens of distinct identities into a single, manageable category. This person had lived through the siege of Tenochtitlan, had walked its causeways, had breathed the smoke of copal resin at the foot of the Templo Mayor, and then had died in a conquest that didn't just end a civilization. I rewrote one. What the colonial record preserved about this person was nothing. What their DNA preserved, locked inside the dense mineralized roots of their molars, was everything. For 400 years, the story of the Aztec people was written almost entirely by the people who destroyed them. Spanish friars, military administrators, and royal chroniclers produced detailed accounts of Aztec life, religion, and origin, accounts that were thorough, sometimes even sympathetic, and almost always filtered through the assumptions of men who believed they were documenting a conquered lesser world. Fray Bernardino de Sahagún spent decades compiling the Florentino Codex, a staggering 12-volume ethnographic record assembled in the 1570s. Hernán Cortés sent letters directly to King Charles V, framing the Mexica as sophisticated enough to be worth conquering, simple enough to require it. The origin story these records enshrined went like this. The Aztec people, properly the Mexica, had migrated south from a mythical northern homeland they called Aztlan, the place of herons, sometime around 1100 CE. They wandered for generations, guided by their patron deity Huitzilopochtli, before settling on an island in Lake Texcoco, where an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a serpent, the sign their god had promised. There, in 1325, they founded Tenochtitlan. Within 2 centuries, through military alliance, tribute systems, and relentless expansion, they had built the most powerful empire in Mesoamerican history. The consensus was clean, logical. It drew from both Aztec imperial mythology, which the Mexica themselves had cultivated and, at times, deliberately rewritten to legitimize their dominance, and from Spanish administrative needs, which required a single, traceable people rather than a mosaic of overlapping communities. Physical archaeology seemed to confirm the general shape of it. Ceramics from the basin of Mexico showed distinct stylistic shifts corresponding roughly to the arrival period. Burial sites at Tlatelolco and within the Templo Mayor precinct displayed consistent ritual patterns. Linguists traced Nahuatl's spread as a kind of imperial fingerprint, a language of power that moved as the empire moved. It was a tidy explanation, supported by stone and text and ceramic sequence. Scholars agreed, textbooks said so, and for 400 years, almost nobody thought to check what the bones themselves remembered. Then DNA arrived. In 2022, a team led by molecular anthropologist Johannes Krause at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, in collaboration with researchers at the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico City, published a landmark genomic study in the journal Nature. The sample set was unprecedented for Mesoamerica, 92 ancient individuals, spanning from roughly 1200 BCE to 1500 CE, drawn from burial sites across the basin of Mexico and surrounding regions, including individuals interred within the Templo Mayor, complex itself, the ceremonial heart of the Aztec Empire, excavated over decades by archaeologist Eduardo Matos Moctezuma. Getting usable DNA from these samples was, by any scientific measure, brutal work. Mesoamerica is not a geneticist's paradise. The region's tropical humidity, acidic soils, and centuries of microbial activity degrade organic material with relentless efficiency. DNA doesn't simply fade in these conditions, it fractures. It shortens into fragments no longer than a few dozen base pairs, contaminated by environmental microbes and the molecular residue of centuries of handling. The team worked from petrous bones, the dense rock-like portion of the skull behind the ear canal, the single best-preserved source of ancient genetic material in the human body, and from dental pulp, sealed inside tooth roots like a biological time capsule no larger than a grain of rice. Even then, many samples yielded nothing. Others yielded fragments so degraded they required specialized computational reconstruction to assemble into anything readable. What they could read rewrote the map. Ancient DNA sequencing works in its simplest terms, like reconstructing a document that has been shredded, soaked in water, and left in a basement for 800 years. You gather every fragment you can find, use the known structure of the human genome as a reference template, and computationally reassemble the overlapping pieces into something coherent enough to compare. The comparison is where the story lives. Researchers align ancient genomes against both other ancient samples and a library of modern populations, looking For shared segments, inherited blocks of DNA that indicate common ancestry. The longer the shared segment, the more recent the shared ancestor. The more populations share a given pattern, the older and more widespread the founding event. What Krauss's team found didn't match the colonial narrative, not even close. Based on the archaeological record and Aztec origin mythology, the genetic expectation was relatively straightforward. A founding population with deep ties to northern Mesoamerica, or the semi-arid regions of what is now northern Mexico, consistent with a southward migration corridor, arriving in the basin of Mexico sometime in the late 1st millennium CE, and mixing primarily with already established Nahua-speaking communities already present in the lake basin. Instead, the sequencing revealed a genomic architecture of staggering complexity. The ancient individuals recovered from within the Aztec imperial period, roughly 1300 to 1521 CE, showed not one founding lineage, not two, but at minimum 3 genetically distinct ancestral streams converging in the basin of Mexico across different time periods and from different geographic directions. One stream, the deepest and most ancient, traced back to the first populations to enter Mesoamerica over 15,000 years ago. The founders of founders, whose descendants had lived in central Mexico for millennia before the Aztec state existed in any form. A second stream showed clear genetic affinity with populations from the Pacific coastal lowlands, groups whose presence in the highlands the colonial record never documented, and whose very existence as a distinct Mesoamerican founding population had been invisible to archaeology until the genomes spoke. And then there was the third. Here's where it gets strange. A significant portion of the ancient Aztec period genomes carried a genetic signature that matched no known living population in Mexico or Central America. It was not background noise. It was not contamination. It was a coherent, recurring pattern appearing across multiple individuals from multiple burial contexts, including high-status interments within the Templo Mayor precinct itself, showing up at levels between 12% and 19% of total ancestry in affected individuals. Researchers working in this space use a specific term for populations like this, ghost populations, groups that left their DNA in descendants but left nothing else. No confirmed sites, no identified language, no named culture in any colonial document ever produced, not a trace in stone, not a word in any codex, a ghost written into the genome of an empire. The discovery placed the Aztec genome firmly in conversation with one of the most consequential questions in Mesoamerican archaeology. Who exactly were the people already living in the basin of Mexico before the Mexica arrived? The colonial record, working from Mexica imperial mythology, which the Aztec state had actively curated, and, in at least one documented episode under ruler Itzcoatl in the 1420s, deliberately purged by burning historical records, described earlier inhabitants as the Chichimecs, a catch-all term for various northern groups, and the remnants of the Toltec Empire centered at Tula. The Mexica claimed Toltec descent as a marker of cultural legitimacy. It was useful mythology. But the DNA disagrees with its tidiness. The genomic data shows that the people already present in the basin of Mexico when the Mexica arrived were not simply Toltec remnants or diffuse northern migrants. They were a deeply layered population carrying ancestry from that unidentified third stream, the ghost, as well as from groups genetically affiliated, with ancient populations from southern Mexico and the Gulf Coast, genetic relatives of the people who had built earlier Mesoamerican civilizations, including, potentially, the still mysterious Olmec, whose own genomic profile remains almost entirely unsequenced. Not one group, not a simple prior occupant. A mosaic of human history so tangled that the Mexica, in migrating into the basin of Mexico, were not arriving in empty territory or moving among simple predecessors. They were entering a population whose genetic depth made their own origin story look like a footnote. The not X but Y structure runs through the entire dataset. Not northern migrants replacing earlier groups, but a multi-directional convergence of populations, some ancient beyond any named civilization, accumulating in the lake basin across thousands of years before the Aztec state formalized them under a single administrative identity. Not a people with one origin, a people with 6, not a culture that erased what came before. A biological archive of everything that came before, written into every cell. Co-researcher Maria C. Avila Arcos at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, who has spent over a decade developing ancient DNA methodologies specifically calibrated for tropical degradation environments, noted in a companion paper that the admixture events visible in the Aztec period genomes likely reflect centuries of trade network integration, intermarriage between elite lineages from different polities, and forced resettlement of conquered populations. All processes the colonial record touched on obliquely but never mapped with any genetic precision. The Aztec Empire was, in biological terms, an admixture engine, Every tributary city-state that sent its daughters to Tenochtitlan, every community forcibly relocated to work in the Lake Basin's Chinampas, every merchant who settled near a foreign market left a genetic signature in the capital's population. The colonial record gave us the politics. The DNA gives us the biology of that politics, and the numbers are specific. Of the 92 ancient individuals analyzed, 67 yielded sufficient endogenous DNA for full genomic analysis. Of those, 41, roughly 61%, showed ancestry proportions inconsistent with any single origin model. The ghost population signal appeared in 23 individuals across at least 4 distinct burial contexts spanning 2 centuries. Comparing these ancient profiles against a reference panel of 1,847 modern indigenous Mexican and Central American genomes, the researchers found that elements of all 3 ancient streams persist in living populations today, though in combinations and at frequencies that no colonial document ever predicted or described. Today, roughly 68 million people in Mexico carry measurable genetic signatures from populations the colonial record never named, never counted, and in several cases, actively erased. The genetic inheritance of the Aztec world didn't vanish with Tenochtitlan's fall. It dispersed. It survived smallpox, forced conversion, 3 centuries of colonial administration, and the deliberate suppression of pre-contact identity. It's in the cells of people who may have no idea their ancestry includes a ghost whose name we don't know, whose language we cannot reconstruct, whose cities, if they built cities, we have not yet found. This matters beyond Mexico. The same pattern of colonial documentation erasing or simplifying pre-contact population complexity appears in study after study across the Americas. A 2021 study led by Nathan Nakatsuka at Harvard Medical School, published in Science, found analogous ghost population signals in ancient genomes from the Caribbean, founding populations that contributed substantially to the ancestry of later civilizations, but appear in no European administrative record. In South America, research by Lars Ferin Schmitz at the University of California, Santa Cruz identified pre-Inca population layers in Peru, whose genetic profiles diverged sharply from both the Inca imperial population and their documented predecessors. The same story, different continent. Colonial record simplified, DNA complicated. The biology refused the paperwork. We carry pieces of these people in our cells, not metaphorically, literally, in the mitochondrial lineages past mother, to child in unbroken chains, in the autosomal segments inherited from ancestors whose names were stripped the moment the monasteries took charge of the record-keeping. Every person of Mexican indigenous descent carries the genomic fingerprint of civilizations that predate the Aztec state, predate the Toltec, predate any named polity in the colonial archive. The ghost population's DNA persists at measurable frequency in modern populations from Oaxaca, Guerrero, and the Valley of Mexico. The colonial record said these people were gone, absorbed, replaced. The genome says they never left. There are also questions about what this means for the Aztec origin myth itself. Aztlan, the northern homeland, the long migration south. The genomic data doesn't disprove it. Migration signals consistent with a northern ancestral connection do appear in some Mexica-affiliated individuals, but they appear as one thread among many, not the defining founding event the colonial record, and Aztec imperial mythology placed at the center of everything. The migration happened, probably, but the Mexica who arrived in the basin of Mexico were already a composite people, already carrying ancestry from multiple prior populations, already more genetically complex than the myth required them to be. They arrived not as a people apart, but as a people woven from the same broad tapestry as everyone they encountered. The Aztec state needed a clean origin story. Empires always do. Aztlan served that purpose. It gave the Mexica divine mandate, cultural distinctiveness, and a mythology that justified dominance over groups they had to absorb or defeat. The Spanish colonial apparatus then inherited a simplified version of that already simplified myth and enshrined it in the documentary record as fact. For 400 years, the simplified myth was the story. Then a genetics laboratory quietly dismantled the whole thing with 92 teeth and a mass spectrometer. You can burn a library. The Aztec state burned its own records in the 1420s, and the Spanish burned what remained after 1521. You can suppress a language, erase a name from stone, reclassify an entire people under an administrative label of your choosing. But you cannot reach inside the petrous bone and edit what the body preserved. The molecular record doesn't answer to empire. It doesn't answer to myth. It doesn't answer to the man with the quill deciding which histories deserve to survive. Most of what we call civilization is a story told by survivors, usually by those who won, who built monuments, who left documents legible to the people who came after them. The populations whose DNA appears in those Templo Mayor burials, but whose names appear in no colonial codex, were not winners in that sense. They built nothing that survived conquest. They left no text we can read. They exist only because the chemistry of bone is more durable than the politics of record-keeping. The story of the Aztecs is not finished. It has barely begun. As genomic sequencing technology advances, as more pre-contact burial sites across Mesoamerica are sampled, as indigenous communities engage with and direct the terms of their own ancestral research, a process already underway through collaborations between geneticists, and on organizations like the Consejo Nacional de Pueblos Indígenas, we will continue recovering identities. The Colonial Archive tried to make permanent, and permanent silences tried to enforce. And somewhere in a climate-controlled archive in Mexico City, a molar no larger than a thumbnail holds the rest of the answer. Sealed, patient, waiting for a question good enough to deserve it. There are thousands of stories like this one, sitting in monastery drawers and laboratory freezers and museum basements, waiting to tell us who people actually were, rather than who someone else needed them to be. Subscribe so you're here when we find the next one.